Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's RedZone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello and welcome. This is Bill Murphy. I want to welcome you to this podcast where I interviewed Jason Kasch, who is the Chief Information Officer at the Structural Group, which is based out of Maryland. And Jason and I have known each other for many years. The company is focused in the construction industry and 30 plus or so offices around the country. He works with about 4,000 employees, 2,000 of which are mobile, which he'll get into in this podcast. And what we focus on today is talking about how he used file syncing technologies to solve problems that he faced, both at the CEO level, all the way down to pulling off his ultimate strategies with disaster recovery, data security governance, and high availability. And it was really interesting talking to him because he's one of the most innovative thinking CIOs that I know, brings a lot of creative juice to solving really interesting problems. And he also sits on the board, and I've been in those meetings, so I've seen the interaction at the board level with the CEO and the other executive members that sit on that board. And he's also quite a heavyweight technologist himself and really pushes his staff to come up with creative solutions. So there's quite a lot of ground that we cover, and this is a really powerful set of solution set that he came up with to solve this particular problem. And you can see the show notes and links out to the specific products we talk about, and I'll post the show notes on the blog site so that you can refer back to them when we refer to vendors and books and interesting things that he's reading. So I hope you enjoy and look forward to getting your comments on the podcast as you listen to it on your drive to work or as you're going to work in the train or however you consume this. Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome to this podcast. I thought it would be good for us to talk a little bit about how your mind works in regards to putting together creative solutions to problems that are, I think, in the industry would be considered pretty complex, or that normal CIOs might lose their way thinking through the problems, or maybe end up overspending or buying too many technologies to solve a problem that you essentially solved with one solution set. So if you don't mind, if you could kind of share a little bit about how you're able to, what challenge you had initially and how that kind of fleshed its way out as you went along.
Sure. Initially, we had a couple of challenges that we were trying to solve, and I didn't realize that they were all interlinked until we got a little bit further down the path. So we had a couple of challenges. One was deployment of applications. The other was access to data in our environment. And a third really was, how do you deploy devices faster and more efficient? And so we headed down this really heavy path with a product called VMware Horizon, which solves each one of those problems kind of independently, but not well cohesively. So we looked at this and we broke it down into three things. We said the three things we're really trying to solve are, one is deployment of desktops. So how fast can you turn around a desktop to an individual when they either lose it or it has to be procured because it's brand new? The second problem was, how do you give access to company-supplied applications? So things as mundane as the Office applications, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Access, and as highly specialized as AutoCAD or MathCAD or some very specific engineering apps. And then the third problem was, how do you give access to the data that these specialized applications need? And so when we looked at it, we said really those are three independent problems you wanted to solve, and we started to head down a path to solve each one of them. We started to look at products that could solve those. We started to hang out in some user forums, And we got turned on to a couple of products. VMware Horizon was one. There's a really cool product called Nasuni, which solves some of these problems really interestingly. And this other product called Data Anywhere, which solved the third of that problem, the one around data access, very elegantly.
Gotcha. So essentially, what was so you wanted to accomplish three things: application access, deploying applications, access to data, and be able to push your applications and your data down to as many devices as you can and as efficiently as you can.
Correct.
How many devices do you have, Jason?
So we have probably between smart devices, tablet devices, and workstations, I would say upwards of the 2,000 number.
Okay. So it's not a small number of devices you're having to manage. Now, you actually engaged in a pilot, right, of VMware Horizon. You just didn't look at the marketing literature. You actually tested this out, right?
So we engaged VMware directly through a third party, through a partner of theirs, and we paid for a paid engineering proof of concept for about $20,000. And the proof of concept ran a good 3 months. We put together the type of use case scenarios we wanted to get solved and how we would see them solve it.
That's great. So is that a typical R&D budget that you have each year, or is that a relatively new development for you as far as being able to not just kind of look at the marketing brochure, download a piece of software and just kick it around, but it sounds like you went down kind of a serious effort of discovery. Is that a normal budget for you for that kind of stuff?
No, not generally. It came about because that product, Horizon, has a lot of hair on it. So it's a really big product, and it requires a lot of time and effort to get it in your environment. And VMware's not really keen on giving their stuff away to try it out. So it turned into us requiring to do a paid proof of concept. But as we walk down this path, I've actually found myself in the last year to 18 months doing more and more paid proof of concept based engineering arrangements, much smaller in price and scope. But I've found that this has been a recurring trend where up until about 18 months ago, we really didn't do paid proof of concepts. We would ask either a vendor or a third-party integrator to come in and say, here's our data, show us how you would implement this. But the process of actually putting it on your own hardware, putting it within your firewall, having your hands on it, be able to touch it and feel it and smell it and see how it reacts, those have become paid engagements. And I think it's an area we're going to carve out of our budget to actually have moving forward. I think we got a lot more out of it, and we understood it a lot better than we would to just have an organization build it and then show us how it works.
You probably get a lot more of the heavyweights on the vendor side, too. I would imagine they're probably lining up a little bit more seriously by doing that, too. Did you find that the case?
I did, especially in the case of this VMware. I mean, the $20,000 or so that it cost for us to do the engineering POC, I mean, that product carried a $500,000 year one price tag to it. So it wasn't insignificant from a mid-market IT budget. And so we wanted to make sure we really got the product right. And at the end of the day, what we found was it didn't solve any of those three problems that we wanted to solve.
Well, I want to keep moving down the other products because I think one of the things people need to be aware is Citrix and VMware they're definitely application delivery technologies. And I also found VMware to be quite a challenge from an installation point of view. I know what we're going to get to is something in my opinion, turns the whole discussion on its head. So, but before we go on to the Data Anywhere, let's talk about Nasuni. So Nasuni was also pretty serious. How did you run into Nasuni, and how did you uncover them?
So we ran into Nasuni as we were doing a bunch of web searching around this data access type of problem. And Nasuni's head kind of popped up in all of the research we were doing as a number 2 or number 3 player in that space. And what they do very differently is take the data that you have in your environment and they replicate it. They use this term called eventually consistent. And so you put a series of these devices within your environment and they talk to each other, and they eventually, over a series of days, weeks, months, however long it takes, depending on the amount of data that you have, eventually they make the data consistent amongst all of those devices, and then they just move the delta changes between the data from site to site to site. And the really interesting thing that they do is then they leverage AWS, Amazon Web Services, and they have an instance of your data at AWS. But part of the challenge with their product is it doesn't use your inherent security model. It doesn't use AD. It doesn't use your security model. And so you have to keep a duplicative method for keeping all of that information in sync. And then what really concerned me is once it's out at AWS, if we forget to remove an employee when we remove them out of AD, what happens to that? Do they still have access to that data? So there was a lot of questions that they left, and also turned out to be a rather significant investment when we have 30 small to mid-sized offices. They have about, anywhere from 10 to 40 people in it. So they're not overly huge, but we have a number of those scattered throughout the country. And so I think that product would probably be more relevant to someone that's got a couple of really large locations versus a bunch of small locations.
Well, I think also part of your skill is not only you have a computer science background as well, so you're able to really get into the guts of when your team brings some of these challenges up. You can really question them quite deeply on these products. Would you find that the case?
I do, and I find it helpful. I mean, actually the team that works for me is way deeper in technology understanding than I am at this point. I think the value I bring to the table is having a background in it, have done it in years past. A lot of these technologies aren't revolutionary. They come round and around and around. We go from client server to centralized to distributed to centralized, and that circle keeps going round and round. And it's the names of the products and the way that they solve the problems are different, but the actual under the covers, it's either centralized or it's distributed. It's one or the other.
So this is the interesting thing. So you have a real deep understanding of the technology, but then also, as I know from working with you, you're working right with the board at the top, and you're actively engaged with them and understanding the business, where it's going. I know you actively sit with the CFO. You're very fluent with finance as well as the technology. And I'm particularly interested in understanding what was the challenge the CEO was having that was really interesting in your approach to solving this problem. Can you share that a little bit?
So the CEO had a concern that company files were residing in personal cloud systems, Dropbox specifically. And we didn't have a solution for that outside of the Microsoft platform. Let me back up a little bit. Actually, we deploy and deliver computing devices centrally through IT. So we don't have a formalized bring your own device policy or procedure. But what we do know is that people are definitely using them, and they're multiplying like rabbits in our environment, and we're forced to support that environment. Now, we should be supporting it because our job as IT professionals is to enable the business. And I think that's where one of the advantages when you ask, how am I able to speak fluently with them, it's to step out of the technology for technology's sake and look at what those individuals do and why they want to do it and how they want to get it accomplished, and then try to match technology with it. So our CEO is a typical CEO. He doesn't use a ton of customized applications that IT would generally support. He's not using AutoCAD every day. He's not using MathCAD every day. He is a civil engineer by trade, but he's also a CEO. So he's very email heavy. He's very internet heavy. And really that lends itself to a tablet-based device. And his particular tablet of habit is the iPad, which isn't a device that we have in our environment. We're a Microsoft application and Microsoft software organization, so we have general laptops and Surface devices and everything that's centralized around the Windows platform, and he just doesn't use it. And so he had some concerns around sharing data because he does it today. How does our CEO share his data amongst his own devices when he's using a platform that we don't even support internally. Or he does it through a third-party application, or what I would consider a consumer-based application with Dropbox. And so he came to us with some heavy concerns because he's an incredibly heavy user of Dropbox, and he recognized that. And as he went around the company and he asked about how he could share files with someone and how they shared files with him, it continually came back to this, well, just put it on Dropbox. Just put it on Dropbox. So him and I had a very lengthy discussion around what that meant from a data governance perspective. Data governance meaning, as an IT word, right? He didn't say that. What he said is he had a concern about company files which were sitting in personal cloud systems.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how it's kind of married from top to bottom. And of course, for our listeners, there's one other piece that I think that people should know is sort of how I've kind of envisioned you as being like the hub of this, not only the hub of a 4,000 employee company in IT, and you got 30 locations and there's quite a mobile device challenge, but you're sort of sitting in the hub also of inputs coming at you, like how to solve this problem. So you've got your CEO using Dropbox. You've got myself and my team recommending, different systems and solutions for disaster recovery. You're looking at Nasuni and you're looking at VMware, and you're coming to decisions that I thought were very, very creative in the end. And maybe that would give us a good opportunity to talk about kind of how you started to pull this together and how you ended up solving the problem with your CEO, your disaster recovery, your high availability, your technical challenges that you wanted with Filesynch and such. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we engaged RedZone to help us understand our disaster recovery. At the end of the day, that's what we called it. But really, it was about polling all of our senior executives about, A, what they thought was important in the environment, and B, where they felt that IT was at this given point in time. And then what RedZone did was be able to put a map together for us that said, here is the perception of where the organization thinks you are from an IT perspective, and here's the reality as you spoke with the IT individuals, and here's the gap analysis. And some things that stood out for us very readily were we had an outstanding backup methodology, but our restore methodology in the event of a full disaster was weeks before we could even think about restoring one single piece of data. Now, IT, generally, backup and recovery, you would think that every IT organization does that well, and we thought that we did it well. What we didn't recognize is, like I said, there were some gaping holes. So that's one. The other was we had a company policy, if you would, that said we don't keep any data local. So as IT, we kind of turned a blind eye to what that really meant. The reality is we issued laptops to people, and they have data on their local computers. Whether we backed that up or didn't back that up, in the event that that laptop got lost, stolen, run over by a forklift, that data is still relevant to that individual. And so even though we had a policy that said we wouldn't store it local, the reality is they were either storing it local or they were coming up with a creative way to back that up on their own, which then lost the visibility of that data from the corporate veil perspective. So those were a couple of items that were gaping holes for us when we said, well, what are some of the strategies that we have to employ? And then another was, we've got these 30 different locations, and how do you make sure that if you lose a location for a disaster or even for like an epidemic, right? A disaster is probably the easier one to solve because you just restore it back exactly the way it was. But what if there's an epidemic and everyone in the office just is sick, but they can still work? And so if all the data resides at their facility, how do you still get them access to their data so that they can work at their leisure? Because not everyone's coming to the office because maybe there's an influenza and they don't want to get sick by coming in. So those were kind of the multitude of swirly, really loosely defined items that we were trying to work with in combination with this challenge of personal cloud data. And for me, as we started to talk through these exercises over a 2 or 3 month period, really two things started to stand out for me as distinct problems that could solve a multitude of these challenges. And one was, how do you take your existing data, where it lies, and present it on any platform, anywhere, and can you have it fully redundant? So that was the first piece. It was the data. Then the second piece was, how do you give access to these applications? Because the data in its native form isn't really good if you don't have an application that can open that data. So let's take the case in point of an iPad. Let's say that you have that data stored as an access file, but the iPad can't run Access, or at the time it couldn't, before Microsoft 365 deployed that on the iDevice. You didn't have it. So then how do you deliver that application to get access to the data? And that's what led us down this original POC for Horizon, because it seemed like they were the only one that could do it.
Gotcha. Now, so we've gone through, you've looked at VMware, you've looked at Nasuni, and so now you're on to Data Anywhere. But if I remember correctly, your first conversations with Varonis didn't go very smoothly, or didn't go quite where you're expecting them to go, right?
It didn't. We didn't actually, and my hat's off to James over at RedZone, because he kept hammering us about that product. He actually seemed to know more about the Varonis product than Varonis did themselves. And so we had our sales and engineering individuals on the call, and we asked point-blank questions, and they said to us, no, that's not how it works. So we got off the call, and James called us back and said, guys, you really need to peel the onion back on this Varonis product, because based on what you're telling me you would want it to do, you can get it to do that. It's just not obvious to Varonis on the other side as to what you were trying to get solved.
Yeah, I do remember that. It was an interesting discussion. I think probably because both of you guys are computer science guys, you probably confused them.
Well, I think James and I both saw it as you guys have implemented it, so you know how the product does work. But as I started to hear what they said, my mind starts thinking, well, it can absolutely do what we want it to do. There's a couple of components that it's missing, but if it could do those couple of components, then this product absolutely will do exactly what we want.
What I find, I wasn't thinking about, because I know you don't have like huge, security isn't on the top of your Rolodex every single day for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is you're a construction company, so it's just not something that's on your radar. So we never really talked much about security, but it's really interesting at the end of the day how you ended up having not only high availability, disaster recovery, solving the CEO problem, but also having data governance, which is partially the issue you mentioned with the Nasuni having your data potentially in the Amazon cloud, and how do you deal with deprovisioning users that are at the core of your network. But you, in essence, have 30 sites that you now can govern data access, which is, to me, just absolutely fascinating. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think you've uncovered something that is a lot of people are wrestling with right now.
So there's two keys to making the whole thing happen. So for us, it was to be able to have multiple replicas of all of our data at multiple locations. So that was the first piece. So that solves the disaster recovery piece, and it has nothing to do with Varonis. We actually leverage Microsoft's DFS, distributed file system, to do a two-way full synchronization replication between all of our 30 locations and our corporate data center. And that gave us two things. It gave us quick, real-time access from the people that sit at that location who are working on the data, so they don't have to traverse the entire network to pick up a file and work on a file. And some of those files are massive. They're AutoCAD files, they're video files, they're gigantic. And our customers are not going to wait for that file to get down so that they can make a change on an engineering document. So that data's got to reside right at their fingertips on their local LAN, and every one of our LANs at all of our 30-plus locations all have a file and print server. And so they can work local, they can work offline. So if a circuit goes down, it doesn't incapacitate their business. We also have manufacturing facilities in 4 locations. And if the internet circuit goes down and you can't manufacture your product, then you're going to grind the company to a halt. So the first piece was, how do I take that data? And then the other challenge was, how do I give them out-of-band access to that data? Well, we did that through replication using DFS back to our corporate headquarters. And so now we have 2 copies of that data. If they happen to be sitting at corporate, then they get a local copy of that data from our corporate file server. If they're sitting in, let's say, Dallas, then they get the Dallas version of that. If we have individuals that travel from location to location, because we have a couple of locations that, as business units, they kind of operate together. So we have a Kansas City office that works really close with a New Jersey office, which works really close to the Pittsburgh office. And so we can set up a 3-way replication between all of those sites so that now all of those sites have all of the same data at the same time at their fingertips. So that was the first piece of the puzzle that we solved, that actually we stumbled on as we talked to Varonis and started to talk about the way they implemented their tool, which was putting a Varonis, so you spin up either a physical appliance or a virtual instance of this thing called Varonis Data Anywhere, and it's a software product, and it attaches to your Active Directory so that it knows about your security rules and rights and who can have access to what and who can't. And then it web enables over a known port all of that data where it sits without having to move it, and maintains your existing security structure. And they've got an app that runs on the iOS device, on the Android device, in the Metro interface. You can get access to it through the web, through a URL, or through a syncing mechanism on a Windows desktop, similar to how Dropbox worked. And so what their solution was to take that system and put it in 30 locations. And that gets really complex from a routing perspective, because how does an individual know whether that file system is in Dallas and Denver or Pittsburgh, or really they could care less. And so what we said is, well, we can combine this Data Anywhere tool with Microsoft's DFS solution, and we can web enable the consolidated DFS data that happens to sit in our corporate infrastructure. We can web enable that in single instance. So whether you touch a file at our Dallas office, or you touch it at our corporate office, or you touch it from an iPad sitting at a conference, within seconds, that file is now maintained consistently amongst all of those data points. And so that solves for us disaster recovery, real-time availability, bring your own device access because it's only using current AD credentials. And so we've killed all 3 of those birds with one stone.
Right, right. Yeah, it's fascinating. Very important what you found. So I'm hoping that this is great information for everybody that is listening today. A couple rapid-fire questions because I want to get you on your way to your next meeting. What's your favorite non-business, non-IT book? So I have 2 teenage adults in my house that, as you know, and so once they become teenagers and they want to be adults, they don't really want to talk to their parents very often. So I read absolutely every book that they pick up first and foremost, so that I can have a conversation. You know, they're going to sit quiet at the dinner table for a half an hour, and then the minute you go to pick up something, now they want to talk. So I've read every popular post-apocalyptic teenage book out there, the Divergent series, Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, all of them. And they're exciting books, but my personal 2 favorites are Michael Crichton's Prey and any of the Jack Reacher series by Lee Child. Ah, interesting. That is great. That's a great idea on how to hang in there tough with your teenagers. My kids are I have one at the teenage years, but Yeah, that's a good point. Just read the darn books, and then you have like something to talk about, right?
Yeah, because eventually they're going to want to talk about something, and if you've already read ahead, so you're already past them, they can have that conversation. But then you can slide in, well, how was your math class today? And because the dialogue's already there.
That is great. I love it. What a great idea. Oh, perfect. Okay. What is your favorite IT book?
My all-time favorite IT book is Business at the Speed of Thought by Bill Gates, written in 1999. I think it's still germane today, and I think if people were to go back and read it, he talks about a digital nervous system, which really in today's terminology, that's information and data governance, and he was 15 years ahead of all of us.
For the aspiring CIO, so someone that looks up to you and says, I want to be Jason when I get older, what's been the biggest that you would say to someone that you were mentoring?
There's probably three things. I think it would be to understand your company's data assets and their sprawl and what to do about it, because we forget that data is a huge asset for the organization that doesn't come and go like people do. The next would be to provide or figure out how to provide an always-on architecture so people can work when they want to work, where they want to work, wherever that is in the world. And the third is to not forget about bandwidth. So as data needs grow with movies, full-feature, high-definition training, which we do in our company, large spreadsheet files, bandwidth is going to get in the way eventually. So figure out how to get your hands around that so that you can implement these things.
Great. That's great advice. This is great advice. So I'm sure there'll be managers and wannabe CIOs that are going to really look forward to getting those pieces of wisdom, Jason. Well, I want to let you go, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, Jason, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Okay, have a good day.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's RedZone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.